episode of Unlocking California Politics. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by my colleague, Laiza Negrete, the Vice President of Political Affairs for the California Association of Realtors. Laiza joined C.A.R. in 2007, where she started as a political affairs field representative, and now she leads CREPAC, C.A.R.'s political action committee, and one of the most powerful and influential in Sacramento. She's been named as one of Capital's 100 Best and Brightest. Laiza is known for her strategic approach to our tough political races and campaigns. She serves on the National Advisory Council for the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, holds a degree in government from Cal State University, Sacramento, and a JD from McGeorge Law School. Welcome, Laiza.
Thank you, Sanjay.
It's great to have you on the show, Laiza. And before we go over this year's general election results, let's talk about your role at C.A.R. You are staff for California's Real Estate PAC, or CREPAC. Can you talk about CREPAC for a moment? What is CREPAC? What does it do?
CREPAC is a board of volunteer realtors that represent various parts of the state, and they work to evaluate candidates at the local, state, and federal level that they choose to support based on realtor party values. So they also oversee the LCRC program the local associations have, and their job is to find the best candidates that support the realtor party.
Now, you use the term LCRC. What is that, and can you explain that?
Sure. So CREPAC's job in evaluating candidates is to decide which candidates are best for realtor party values. The local associations alike also have the ability to create their own committees that can do essentially the same thing that CREPAC does for the local level. So city council races, water boards, school boards, the local associations have the same ability that CREPAC has with all of the local elections.
Now, to some extent, there's a cycle with CREPAC, right? Where some years are busier than other years. Like election this past year, presumably was a lot busier. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and an election year is really 2 years, or I should say an election cycle. So we call it an election year when state races are happening, but in a non-election year, we still see plenty of local races happening where we work with LCRCs to make sure that locals are supporting candidates that are helpful for realtors.
So let me just talk about the state level, for example. So on the state level, we have constitutional offices like the governor, lieutenant governor, treasurer, et cetera. And then we, of course, have senators and members of the assembly. Does CREPAC potentially weigh in on all of those types of candidates?
Yes, actually, CREPAC is very unique because it interviews folks that are running for state office across the board. So we talk to everyone and anyone who is running for office, including constitutional officers and anyone who's running for insurer, attorney general, all of that. So any state level race, CREPAC weighs in on.
And you mentioned earlier realtor party values. CREPAC is a bipartisan PAC. Is that fair to say?
That is very fair to say. And I think it's good to distinguish it from being nonpartisan. If you're going to engage in politics, you really have to be looking at folks that are representing themselves from one party or another. And the CREPAC supports candidates that are both Democrat and Republican because we focus on realtor issues. And as you know, Sanjay, our issues are very wide on the spectrum of the political sphere.
Right. And that's one thing which I think we have certain values which definitely cross both sides, especially certain issues like home ownership, fair housing. I think it's fair to say that we have actually a fair degree of bipartisan support on those issues at least. So.
Right.
So we saw big changes in the country as a whole in this past election cycle with a higher Republican voter turnout. And we saw many counties in California also move to Trump. Despite that, we remain a deep blue state in terms of our elected officials with a supermajority in both the Assembly and the Senate, albeit a tiny bit smaller of a supermajority. Now, my understanding is that when Kamala Harris first became the Democratic Party candidate, our polling showed, and not just our polling, but polling in general showed quite a surge of Democratic Party enthusiasm at that point. And is it fair to say at that point there was real fear that that could take those Republican numbers even smaller at that point?
Well, elections are very cyclical. And even without or I should say, regardless of who is on the top of the ticket during a presidential year, California tends to have higher voter turnout during those presidential election cycles. There was a lot of energy that we sensed started when Kamala Harris jumped into the presidential race. And now that we've seen what's happened, we noted that that is more energy that was happening outside of California and not necessarily in California, where we saw a lower voter turnout compared to previous election cycles.
And that's not typical in a presidential election cycle in California, correct?
No. So the average presidential turnout in California is about 77%, and we were at 74% this cycle. You might think 74 is not very far from 77%, but every vote counts. Every percentage vote really makes a difference for who wins what races. And so when you look at a 74% voter turnout, it is one of the lowest turnouts in a presidential election in California. And that in itself made it more favorable for Republicans to win in targeted seats where you had Democrats going against Republicans.
And is it fair to say usually that surge in presidential years is driven by an increase in Democratic Party voters?
That's correct. Whenever there's a president on the ballot, there's higher voter turnout. And whenever there isn't a president on the ballot, lower Democratic voter turnout, which means it favors Republicans.
Right, which is what happened in this past election.
Exactly.
We saw certain national trends with, in many areas, sort of more middle income and Latino voters generally moving toward Republicans in many areas. Maybe not, again, a majority, but a significant movement in many cases, as well as we saw persons without a college degree moving heavily toward the Republican. Did we see some of those trends in California?
We certainly did. And it was, if you look at specifically the seats where Republicans picked up, a lot of those are really centered in places where there were already a lot of Republicans. So in fact, all of this 3 assembly seats that were really highly targeted, Wallace, and then the 2 pickup seats with Leticia Carrillo, and then also Jeff Gonzalez, those all are within Riverside County, a county that has the highest not the highest, but the Latino voters are the highest population in those districts. And so we did see some of those national trends play out in California, particularly in those races. You also have a Senate seat where Susset Valladares won. That one encompasses part of LA County and then San Bernardino County. And you could see that its Latino population really trended in the way the national Latino trend was, which is Republican.
Interesting. And so we did see those trends manifest in California. Now let's talk about some specific state or Senate races. Now, CREPAC contributes to many candidates in this state, as you mentioned, at all levels. Are there some races which you think are particularly significant that CREPAC weighed in on in this cycle?
Sure. And I think before I get into those, I want to kind of provide a context for how CREPAC looks at races. They support candidates that are best for realtor party values and protect homeownership. And what does that mean? That really means that we are looking for moderate candidates, folks that believe homeownership is very important to society. And with that, we usually end up fighting the more partisan candidates in each of those races, even in safe Democratic or safe Republican seats. So we engaged in a lot of safe Dem or safe Republican seats where we supported the more moderate candidates, and then we also were able to protect a lot of the Republicans that were in trouble of flipping, and that was very successful based on some of the trends that we discussed. But for example, there was a big difference in Northern California. Heather Hadwick was going against a more conservative candidate, and when you look at a safe Republican seat, that matters because they're going to be a Republican that comes into the California State Legislature, a very blue body. So what kind of Republican do we want? We want a Republican that can not only protect home ownership, but will be also able to be successful in helping us advance the policies that we are fighting for. And that's someone that doesn't marginalize themselves by being so partisan that they can't get along with their colleagues that make up the majority in the legislature. That's one example.
And I think that's a fair point, because I think sometimes people lose sight of the fact that also the Democratic Party supermajority is not a monolith, that you have a lot of moderate Democrats who are looking for allies also who they can work with. So that's why moderates of both sides tend to work better together. And if you have somebody too extreme, those moderate Democrats also then don't have somebody that they can work with.
Exactly. One of the northernmost assembly districts, as we kind of move down in the Bay Area, we are very excited to have helped elect Catherine Stephanie out of San Francisco. Normally, getting a moderate out of San Francisco is really not a realistic goal, but Catherine Stephanie is someone that we think is very pragmatic, very independent, and we think she will be very good for home ownership. If you move a little bit further, in the San Jose area, we supported Patrick Ahrens, who was also going against a very progressive candidate. In the Central Valley, we helped protect Esmeralda Soria, who, even though should be in a safe Democratic district, because of the turnout, she was really in trouble of losing her seat. So she's an incumbent, but she's been good for our industry, so we help protect her. And then in the Central Valley, we also helped another Republican who really made a big difference, and we're really proud of that win because sometimes safe Republican seats kind of go unnoticed by a lot of folks, and I think that makes the Realtors really stand out because we look at every single seat. And in the Central Valley, we helped David Tangipa win the seat against George Jordanovich, former Congress member. And David Tangipa really understands our industry. He's a realtor himself, so he will come with the values and the understanding of the market, which is very important, as you know, as we try to educate legislators on our issues. So there's a big contrast between himself and the candidate we opposed. And then as we move further down, LA has become a very progressive city. It's very difficult, to find moderates that come out of that area. And we had a very tough race in Laura Richardson versus Michelle Chambers. And at the end, it was a very close race, but we were very successful in helping to elect Laura Richardson there. And then as we move further down, we helped protect Laura Davies, another Republican that was under attack by another industry who, based on a vote, she went against another industry. They attacked her for it, but they were trying to really place a progressive candidate there. So we made sure that she stayed in her seat as well. And then I spoke about Greg Wallace also being able to keep his seat. So Valladares, that win was pretty significant as well.
Right, and I'm familiar with some of those races that you mentioned in terms of the dynamics at play. And I paid attention to, especially to that Soria race that you mentioned, because she did win and relative in the scheme of things relatively comfortable, given I believe that in the aggregate Trump actually won her area. And so it's interesting that she was able to prevail in that area. And when you say we, typically we do work with other allies in the business community. Is that fair to say in many of the races?
Yes, we do have a lot of coalition partners, but I think it is very important to understand that the Realtors play a leading role in building coalitions. So, when you look at labor unions and teachers who are, the most powerful groups in California politics, and you look at their decisions, a lot of the times they know who they've picked. For example, union organizations are going to pick union candidates. So most of the time they've already put candidates into place where they know who they're going to support. So there's really no deciphering between one or the other. The Realtors play a very unique role in the Sacramento political community because we really take a look at the candidates from a perspective that no one else does. A lot of the groups that are involved in politics, they put in their own candidates, and there's no choice to make. They put in someone, and that's going to be the candidate that they back. But us, we really look at the viability of a candidate, their values, and so a lot of groups are waiting for us to make a decision. And once the Realtors weigh in, then we have the ability to form coalitions and work with others, particularly the Building Industry Association, a California Apartment Association. We work with Uber this time to help elect moderate candidates and, in the bigger scheme of things, business-friendly candidates.
Right, and I think it's fair to say that even those other business groups also share, in general, this desire to elect these more moderate candidates. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's correct.
So we have 28 new legislators coming in, which is about a quarter of the legislature. It's important for us to build relationships with these members. How do you think that's the best way for our local association and members to do that?
Politics, there's a saying that goes, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And that is to say that, at one point or another, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with someone, you're going to have to talk to them. And so hopefully we've put you in a position through CREPAC support where there is a friendly relationship there. But if local associations are in a situation where they have to speak to someone that CREPAC opposed, it is important that they talk to us so that we coordinate communication. For example, there is a candidate that we opposed, and she's going to be up here. I've been talking to both the association executive as well as the government affairs director. They're setting up a meeting. I've been told that she's ready to meet with us as well. And so the local association and I are communicating back and forth to make sure that we share feedback about how those meetings go and to make sure that our relationship is built. For the most part, elected officials know that they're going to have to work with us because we are a big player in this sphere. And so some of them, it may take them some time to get there because we have opposed them. It was their face and, their campaign, and understandably so, it's very personal. And when that happens, we give them time, but we are always here and accessible to them. And I think that's probably what's most important. Local associations have to be accessible and ready to talk to anyone who's willing to talk to them.
Yeah, that's something we try to get across, I think, even when we do outreaches to a lot of our local associations, is even if this was not the candidate we supported, or maybe you have a difference of opinion with, or difference even in policy positions, there's never a harm in reaching out and trying to build that relationship. Especially, I think so many of our issues really cross, as you mentioned, the political spectrum, right? So somebody may not agree with us in one area, but could very well agree with us in a different area. And there's a lot of shared common interest because we have such a wide spectrum. Something that's been on many members' minds, by your mind and my mind, is we are in a very changing political landscape. You have complete Republican control on the national level. How do you think, with the new administration in the White House, do you have any thoughts about how those national politics might impact us on the state level?
I think for political junkies, which I know you are one of them, that are going to be watching the headlines, there's going to be a lot of political games that are played. And when I say games, I mean they're very real games. There's going to be a lot of fights that are happening in the courts. California has already said it was going to be a sanctuary state for immigration purposes. And so those fights are going to be out there in the courts, maybe through the media and PR circles. But I do believe, as we saw in the past, I mean, we've gone through a Trump administration before, and when it came down to those, issues that matter to citizens, for example, during the pandemic, as well as during, fire season, when we needed a lot of aid, President Trump was there to help the state. So I would say that we're going to continue to see each party do its what it has to do to advance its own issues. But when it comes down to important issues, they're going to have to work together because that's what their job is.
Right. And I think that's very accurate. Governor Newsom has often taken a very strong stance, and President Trump did work together during the pandemic. And as you mentioned, the fires as well. I think the only thing I would add to that is I always think there's a part we just don't know to some extent how, because the administration has outlined as a whole series of different priorities. And I think a lot of it depends on what they end up focusing on in terms of also how California might be affected in our politics. So we do have a big election coming up in 2026.
Yes.
Governor Gavin Newsom, who is a very charismatic figure in California politics, will be terming out. There are candidates who have expressed interest, and some people think there could be more, like Katie Porter and potentially Kamala Harris. So before I touch on the Kamala Harris possibility, who are some of the candidates who you're watching or are paying attention to in this race?
Well, Lenny Kounalakis, the lieutenant governor, came in with a lot of resources and has been at the forefront working at this for, I would say, before anyone else got out there. You have Betty Yee as well. Rob Bonta, the attorney general, is expected to announce at the beginning of the year, is what I hear. We have Tony Thurmond, the superintendent of public education. You have the former mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, who also jumped in. And then Tony Atkins as well. So it's going to be a crowded field, and we are just ending 2024. So my guess is that there's going to be some continued shuffling. And I know you're going to get to Katie Porter. Was there a question there, or should I just go into it?
Keep going. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's start with Katie Porter, and then we'll move to Kamala Harris.
Okay. Well, Katie Porter is very interesting. She came in to this actually last week. She released a poll that says, compared to everyone that has already declared that they're going to run for governor, that she's the top candidate. And understandably so. I mean, she had a lot of media attention on her, particularly famous for, pointing out basic math and boards during her presentations and during committee hearings in Congress. And so I think that she herself will also be a charismatic figure. And considering that she does come with a lot of resources, being one of the top fundraisers as a candidate, I think she may clear the field, not completely, but I do think that a figure like her, as well as Kamala Harris, have the potential of maybe garnering the support of some that are already in the race and getting them maybe to step out. Who those are, I'm not sure. But, when you think of running for office, there are different pockets of money throughout the state of California. A lot of those pockets being in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. You have some pockets in LA, and you have other pockets as well in the ag industry, Central Valley, and then San Diego. So the question is, who's able to garner their support from those various groups? And when you look at how many Bay Area candidates are in, it makes you wonder, how are they going to split up those resources and those endorsements? But I think Katie Porter will have the ability to garner a lot of support.
Seems like both with Katie Porter and Kamala Harris, they also have a national base as well. They could potentially draw on a lot of small donors from across the country, potentially, because they both have a bit more of a national profile too than many of the other candidates. Are there any other races on that level that you are watching in terms of potential on the constitutional offices? Any thoughts about? Has there been any discussions about insurance commissioner that you're aware of, which is also a very important issue for our members?
Yes, I've heard rumors that Pro Tem Mag McGuire is interested in running, and so that's an issue that it's very important to our members right now. So we're going to be watching that race closely. And then if Rob Bonta, moves on, we don't know if, who's going to jump in after that. That's very important. And then, it'll also be interesting to see who jumps in for lieutenant governor. Maybe there's someone that comes in to work with whoever the next governor is and with the potential to run in the future. But I think one of the things that I've seen or have heard people say is, the country hasn't elected its first woman president. Is it time for California to elect its first woman governor?
Oh, that's right. Just a bit of a reminder that it's we've never had a female governor. Are there other things that you think that our listeners would like to know about how CREPAC works?
I think what is important to understand is that CREPAC is very research-based. We look at a lot of the background information, public information that candidates put out there as they're running for office. We, of course, look at those candidates' stances on our issues, and we look at polling. And, if someone is a realtor in a community where we have opposed a candidate, know that it's based on all of those, on issues and on research. We often hear the most from realtors who are not happy with the decisions that CREPAC has made. And sometimes the perception is that CREPAC supports only one candidate, one party and not the other. But we are very bipartisan. All the decisions are made by realtors, and the focus is realtor party issues. So I think in times like these, when our country seems divided and very partisan, that it is very good to remember that when it comes to realtors and the realtor party, we care about home ownership, and those are the candidates that we are choosing to advance forward.
Okay. Thank you, Laiza. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.